Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks, Alex. And it's such an honor to be with these three really distinguished presidential historians. I think the topic tonight that we're really going to focus on is this sort of examination of what's unprecedented and precedented about this moment that we're living through right now. And I think that, a lot of people, and we certainly hear this as journalists at the Washington Post, a lot of people have this sense that we're living through a uniquely wild and uncharted time. A president who tweets aggressive messages at political opponents, and a Speaker of the House who tears up the president's State of the Union address. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, are these new things? How new is this? But I wanted to start actually by just asking each of you to say something about this moment that people might be tempted to look at and think is unique to a Trump presidency, but that we actually have seen before in history, and maybe we need that reminder. You want to start, Alexis?
Sure. I think probably the most obvious thing, and something that I'll start out with, but we should vary throughout the night, is partisanship, rampant partisanship, and publications that have such an obvious political bias, and that has been around from the very beginning. It was, in fact, George Washington's worst nightmare. He didn't claim a political party until after he left office, and even then, he wasn't really vocal about it. But things were quite bad. And Jefferson, in fact, said that he'd never seen anyone take anything, criticism as personally as Washington did. So I think that is definitely something that's not new. And for me, I find that comforting. I find it comforting to know that things have always been this way. This isn't really, it feels like our particular nightmare, and it should. And the founders were reluctant revolutionaries. They were sort of forced, they felt like, to make really dramatic and drastic moves. I don't know, that makes me feel good about the time we're living in. That being said, no guarantees for the future.
So, Lillian, you gave us a heads up that you were going to want us to think about this question before we started discussing what is unprecedented and how to situate that in a historical context. And so, as I thought about it, I found myself racking my brain, and I thought, well, let's see. There's always been the Easter egg roll, at least for a long time, and we're still pardoning turkeys, so there's certain continuities here. But then when I thought a little more seriously, I thought to myself, there are a lot of things structural things that Trump has not changed. We still have a cabinet that has people in it. We still have a vice president. He's still having elections. And that sounds absurd in some ways to say, because we take those structures so for granted. But I think it's also important to look at what he's been able to do within those structures, because you still have a cabinet there, but it's operating in a very different way. And so a lot of what's the same is simply surrounding things that he has managed to use in very different ways. So I think the precedented and the unprecedented collide in lots of circumstances and in important and significant measure.
Great. And we'll definitely talk about that more. So,
I'd say the one thought before the answer is that just because something is unprecedented doesn't mean it's not bad or dangerous. And so often when I get that question, I try to think about, is it in that second category? We've seen something before, but it can be incredibly destabilizing or have had bad consequences before and have them again. But the biggest story, one of the bigger stories is kind of an expansive vision of presidential power, which was at the heart of the impeachment debate and Alan Dershowitz's famous defense. That's not new. This is something that's been building for over a century, at least since Lincoln, in terms of a more expansive vision of presidential power. But certainly since the 70s, we've seen after Watergate an effort to rebuild the executive branch to strengthen the president in response to reforms from the 1970s, and we've seen with Reagan, with Clinton, Bush, we've seen in both parties presidents flexing this muscle in ways that don't totally fit with the 19th century, but are not totally new to what Trump has done. And that's why that Bill-Barr relationship's interesting. Barr is a product really of the 1980s and 90s, and that era where conservatives came to love big presidential power.
Great. Well, why don't we back up to the beginning of the presidency for a moment, and I'll ask you this, Alexis, since you just wrote this great book about Washington. To what extent did the founders and Washington himself have a fairly clear vision of what they thought that role should look like? And, obviously there's not a whole lot in the Constitution that really details what a president should be, how one should act, even, what an abuse of power really is. So, to what extent was that all purposefully left flexible to change with the times?
So much of the presidency was envisioned with Washington in mind. And so they certainly tried to figure out a decent amount in the Constitution and then Washington literally annotated it and wrote president, president, president. But then when he got into office, he created certain precedents and also certain institutions like the cabinet. He didn't feel as if he was getting the advice that he needed from Congress. He went once, and it was a total disaster. He rarely lost his temper in public, and he just completely lost it at Congress. He yelled at them and said, "Why am I even here?" And then he set up the cabinet, and that didn't go so well either. That was Jefferson and Hamilton and the birth of partisanship. But he also, while Washington understood the fragility of these institutions, which I think is really important, and I think that was suggested by the other people on the panel, but I think what's really important to remember is that he also was the first one to sort of sidestep things too, to figure out what worked for him. So of course we have the Whiskey Rebellion, the only time in our history in which a president has, corralled a militia to turn guns on our own people. And in fact, he rode out. He almost got to the field with them to confront a bunch of rebels who weren't actually there. And so I think that is interesting too, that Washington, all the founders, they weren't all-knowing, they weren't perfect, they made plenty of mistakes, both in what they were sort of considering the presidency to be and the limits and the extensions of it, and how they were in the roles itself.
So I know one thing that Doris Kearns Goodwin says a lot, and a number of presidential historians say a lot, is that the great presidents were students of history, and that you can really see throughout the American presidency a number of those figures sort of turning back to study the precedents that had been set. I guess this is for Julian, but anyone can feel free to jump in and answer it. I'm just curious how you look at this moment today when you think about precedent. So, is sort of the risk that we have right now that we're maybe seeing a president who just doesn't really care about the precedents that have been set before? Or is it more that, precedents are still very important, but we may get very new ones set for future presidents. Very hard to say presidents and precedents.
I mean, look, it matters. It matters a lot. I'll start by saying it's not a guarantee of good leadership. So Lyndon Johnson, who I wrote about, he had a good feel of history. He had a good feel of previous presidents. He thought about it all the time. He's kind of consumed with how did he fit compared to FDR. He knew that Harry Truman couldn't get health care through and why he couldn't get it through, and that was the first thing he wanted to prove, along with civil rights, that he could do. But he also ended up in Vietnam, and you can argue his kind of obsession with the fate of Democrats in 1952 when Eisenhower wins the presidency, when Republicans win Congress. That is on his mind all the time when he refuses to withdraw from the war. So I would start by saying it's not a guarantee of good leadership to be very historical. You can make big mistakes, but there are dangers of not having any kind of foundation in the past. What we're learning with President Trump is a lot of the restraint on presidents and a lot of the ways in which they move, it's from themselves rather than through other institutions. That if a president really wants to do something, they can do it. They can do a lot more than we think. And often what checks them is a sense of the dangers or problems other presidents have faced. It's a understanding of the tradition that they're part of. And I think part of what you see in the current White House is, even in contrast to a Richard Nixon, someone who doesn't have that. That's not a foundation. And so he's willing, as he did today, to go into places that I think other presidents are more circumspect, not just because they're good people, but because they have that weight of the institution and the office that they inhabit.
And I would see the relationship of a president to history and an understanding of, it's always been his place in history, as reinforced by an understanding and relationship to the Constitution. Because the Constitution is, in so many ways, the embodiment of our historical commitments and has been the touch point by which predecessors will have related to the past. And so I think that when a president thinks about precedent, a lot of that is, what am I going to see myself doing in relationship to the Constitution? And so that's how it expresses itself.
Well, you've spent a lot of time studying Lincoln, so maybe this would be great to take a moment and talk a little bit about, by the time Lincoln gets to the presidency, how much does it sort of look like it did when George Washington held it? In what ways did he sort of reinvent or push the boundaries of executive power?
Well, Lincoln pushed the boundaries of executive power very forcefully, and he had a circumstance in which he felt he was compelled to do that. Of course, the war was right in front of him, or secession was in front of him, with a good chance of a war following fast along. And he used the words in the Constitution, actually, to go back to what I was just saying, the notion that the oath of office says preserve, protect, defend. And he thought that was his fundamental mission. And if there were other difficulties that his necessary actions might create in relationship to the Constitution, if he was supporting the notion of preserve, protect, defend, then it was okay. So when things erupt after Fort Sumter, Lincoln sets up a blockade around the South. That is the equivalent of an act of war. The president is not allowed to declare war. Congress is supposed to declare war. So then in May, he calls up troops, and it is supposed to be the Congress that calls up troops. Congress is out of session and is not supposed to appear until July. So by the time Congress does appear in July, Lincoln has done all kinds of things that have really pressed the boundaries of the Constitution. And he goes to Congress and says, will you give me retroactive support? And they do in that instance. But there are a number of other ways in which, by suspending habeas corpus, by prosecuting a disloyal citizen who is a copperhead and fomenting disunion in Ohio, and that caused uproar and resentment because Lincoln had gone too far in requiring this person to be tried by a military tribunal as if martial law was in operation. And so sometimes he managed to get Congress to go ahead and ratify something he'd already done. Sometimes he caused tremendous pushback. And then, of course, emancipation. He struggled with, could this be a presidential power? And ultimately, as I think you probably almost all know, he justified it under the guise of military necessity and didn't go further than he thought he could as a military matter. He didn't have the Emancipation Proclamation applied to the border states because they were fighting with the North and they were not part of a logic of military necessity. So he tried to do what he needed to do in face of an uprising in the South, but a lot of it required enormous expansion of presidential powers. And he used the language war powers in his justification to Congress in July of 1861. His first draft said military powers, and then he changed it to war powers. And I think that's really significant because he saw what he might need to do would extend beyond simply arming troops or moving troops. And so I think he was very self-conscious about the Constitution, about the extension of power, and about the necessity for it. But it was not entirely popular with even those in the North. Needless to say, it was not popular with those in the South. But there were a lot of Democrats in the North who objected to a number of the measures he took.
Well, maybe just to sort of stick in this era for a moment, after Lincoln, we of course get Andrew Johnson, who's the first president to be impeached. Could you talk a little bit about what the relationship between Johnson and the Congress looked like, and the echoes that you see today watching Trump's impeachment unfold, and then also ultimately sort of what came of that big push and that first really big push and pull between the Congress and the presidency?
Well, the Congress worried a great deal about the intransigence of the South in the months after Appomattox and the formal end to the war. And as more and more news came in about mistreatment of freed people, about the defiance of the South and re-electing all these Confederates under the conciliatory Reconstruction Plan and sending all these people who'd been in uniform fighting against the Union only months before back to sit in Congress, the Republican radicals in Congress and even moderates who had been fervent supporters of the Union during the war began to resent this conciliatory tone that Andrew Johnson was taking towards the South, and to feel that he had betrayed the purposes of the war and indeed the will of Congress and the powers of Congress. And so radical Reconstruction was imposed, and Johnson just tried to resist it in so many ways and became himself defiant, and at one point went on this speaking tour all over the United States and was entirely vituperative in his commentary about the members of Congress in the North, and it was an ugly scene. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can see certain germs of some of the conflicts of today in those moments.
One thing that I think is also really interesting and worth thinking about is that often I think when people think about presidents who've ignored the law or sort of pushed the boundaries of the law, they tend to think about Andrew Johnson or Richard Nixon, a president who faced impeachment. But as you said, Lincoln pushed the boundaries of the law in many ways, and certainly presidents like Franklin Roosevelt did. Maybe this is a question for you, Julian, since you've spent a lot of time with 20th century presidents, but how do you think through, especially if you think about being in the moment of a president and you're seeing these constitutional challenges, how do you think through whether what we're seeing is just kind of a thing that presidents always do, they're always sort of pushing the boundaries, versus, it's something where we really need to be worried that there's a constitutional threat here?
Well, that's obviously the distinction that you hope Congress can make. And so, yes, all presidents naturally push the boundaries of their power in an effort to either pursue public policy objectives or to preserve their political coalition. And we can go through all the presidents, certainly in modern times, and see some variation of this. Totally legal, and it can be within the normal routines of policy. So Bill Clinton, frustrated with the Republican Congress in the late 1990s, started to aggressively use executive power to make some progress on environmental issues. And Barack Obama did the same with immigration. He did it with carbon emissions. And so you see that. Certainly FDR was incredibly expansive in using federal policy to protect the Democratic coalition, and the idea was in the end that's going to be better for the country. So it's a story we see again and again. But then there are those moments when someone crosses the line, and I can't tell you what the line is, and that's the problem. The Constitution doesn't tell you really what the line is, but certainly one category of activity, which is at the heart of what we just went through, is when a president uses public policy, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy, explicitly for his own political self-interest. Not simply thinking of the politics of an issue, which they all do, but really actually leveraging specific policies to protect themselves. There's other cases where presidents have used the power of the executive branch to do bad things to citizens, to legitimate citizen organizations. We saw that in the 60s with the anti-war movement, activists being infiltrated by law enforcement, or President Nixon specifically targeting them, or the wiretapping of Martin Luther King. Those are the kinds of, I think, crossing the boundary activities that we're looking for. But ultimately, if Congress is not willing to really examine that or act on that, it's hard to retrench that. And I think that is the Constitution by default. It has impeachment in it, and I strongly believe impeachment is a legitimate process, as legitimate as election. But it's clear to me that the Constitution also makes it incredibly hard to go through that process. That's why you have a supermajority requirement in the Senate. And it's in those definitional questions you're asking that the process can often get tripped up.
So why don't we talk a little bit about presidential leadership traits and how it seems like what has made for either a successful president or just someone who can attain the presidency, whether they end up successful or not in it, how that's changed over time. When I did the presidential podcast, one of the things that struck me most was the fact that Thomas Jefferson hated public speaking. And today, that seems like unfathomable that you could have someone who would be president who hates speaking in public. But at the time, of course, being able to master the written word was far more important than his ability to go out and, campaign and give speeches. So, as we've seen technology change and media platforms change, do you all feel like that sort of the core traits it takes to be an effective communicator as a president have changed, or really what makes someone successful today, bears a lot of resemblance to what the sort of core traits that a George Washington or a Lincoln would have had?
It's so hard to imagine George Washington in any context, but just those early years, and his job was to be himself in a lot of ways. It was to present this strong figure, this unifying figure, and he didn't do a lot of public speaking he didn't feel comfortable with it. He was insecure about his deficient education. He had to drop out of school when he was younger, and he was surrounded by men who had been educated at Harvard and College of William and Mary and other places, and who had diplomatic experience, who had been abroad. He had been to Barbados once when he was a teenager. But Washington was, he had also sort of famously studied the rules of civility, which I think was just to work on his penmanship, and he has this totally great signature as a result. But some things, sunk in, and basic things like chew with your mouth closed, and don't flirt.
If you don't have any teeth.
Yes, and he was also, or you don't want to show what those teeth are made of.
Right.
So that's the other thing. He was really uncomfortable all the time, because you can imagine that 18th century dentistry is not so great. And he's also he's penny wise and he's pound foolish, and it shows everywhere. So he'll show up in a gorgeous velvet carriage, but then his teeth are ones that fell out for a reason. Which he keeps in drawers, and he's always, he's getting lectured by his dentist. He's paying a third of the price of the going rate of teeth to his enslaved community. Ivory, all sorts of things, but he's really uncomfortable because they're put together with wires. So what that did was it sort of bolstered what was already this intrigue that was already sort of around him, which was he had this physical presence. He was a little bit taller than everyone else, but he was, everyone struggles to describe him and his body, and he was graceful. He was like an athlete. He had charisma. We have a hard time describing anyone who has charisma. But he would do these things that meant so much to the country when he was making his way, which he did not like, so it was a performance. When he was making his way to the first inauguration, it took a really long time, because things took a long time when you go on horseback, but also he stopped constantly to greet the crowds, and he would do things like bow, and that was really important at the time. It seems like nothing, but we had just had a king, and you bow to the king, and the fact that he bowed to everyone was a really big deal. And when he rode through an area that had been significant during the revolution and they did something special, they put flowers on a bridge, he wrote a thank you note. And so things like that really mattered. His job was to support things, so religious freedom. He wrote to, famously, the synagogue in Rhode Island and all kinds of churches everywhere, just to show that he was open to all kinds of religion. That was important to him. White men, etc. But he was interested in projecting this image and protecting this image of being a unifier to a degree that ended up, it was stilting.
So when you asked your question, I was thinking about the constant refrain about likability that we hear now of our presidential candidates. And I think that would have been unimaginable up until, I'll ask Julian, when likability becomes a factor. But there was a certain deference. People wanted to look up to the president, I think, and feel that person was special, not someone you'd go and have a beer with. And so when
well,
did
Teddy
this...
Roosevelt
Teddy
would
Roosevelt
have this
would
kind
be...
of romance with the person.
Yeah.
Combined with the presence of a press that could sell the person or at least convey the person. So it's a rough start, but I assume that's probably when you can start tracing
that. Because I think that's a significant shift. How
Yeah.
do we want the president to be like us or better than us or different from us? How do we see that?
I mean, I think I'm just thinking about the question. There's two things that are a little different, maybe. One is we don't know exactly how the Trump White House works. So even the even the Twitter feed, there's different stories that some say he actually controls it in the morning and then someone takes over the Twitter feed. I've heard other stories it's not so structured as that. But right now, assuming that's him, the unfiltered, unstructured, unedited communication with the public is different than what we've seen. The comparison's always to FDR and the fireside chats, but if you listen to those are very carefully tailored messages. They're not just like FDR goes out and just says what's on his mind and just, rambles and insults people. But that is the nature of the Twitter feed. And the Twitter feed is the public record of this president, so I take it very seriously. And I think he's doing something different with communication by doing this. I mean, today, attacking a juror. In terms of the language he uses, in terms of the way the words are misspelled. And so I think that might be something different. I can't think of a president who has spoken to the public that way. And the other thing I'll just say is I do think all presidents lie. And there's lots of big lies, and the Gulf of Tonkin was a big lie by LBJ that got us into a big, terrible war. But there is qualitatively something different about his willingness to use constant disinformation in his public pronouncements and in his messaging that I think is taking us into a different realm. It's not checked. It's not as if he even feels the need to hide this sometimes. It's a comfort with lying. It's truly a comfort with lying as a legitimate form of discourse from a president. And now we have a media infrastructure that will convey those lies at a massive level, not small news, city newspapers or some partisan papers. This is a network and websites that have enormous reach. So I think on those two grounds, it is important to see some of the changes we're actually witnessing right now. I don't know how we roll those back, but I think he's really setting a new precedent in those two parts of his rhetoric.
Just to underscore one aspect of what you were saying, I remember after Obama came into office, there was so much attention to this first black president, and there was a certain amount of noise about he's getting overexposed. The notion of what that represented in comparison to the Twitter feed, a constant.
Yeah.
It's a real shift in understanding the appropriate and desired level of interaction between a president and a populace. And you said, can we ever roll it back? One thing I wonder about is, even if the most magnificent human being and politician in the world were to become a president in the near future or even the medium future, could that person stop tweeting?
Right.
Because does the public now expect to have this constant intimacy with the president and all her or his thoughts?
Yeah.
And it's
true.
It's really hard to imagine that toothpaste going back in the
No, it's going to be very hard. And presidents, when they see other presidents have done something, there's a temptation to do it again. But I was just sorry. I was just looking, related to this, I was just looking at the news coverage of the last months of the Nixon presidency. And many of you will remember that before the tapes come out, it's the transcripts of the tapes and the expletives deleted, meaning the president cursed a lot, and so lots was marked out. But it's remarkable if you read, the major newspapers of the time, just how shocking the expletives deleted was. There is serious discussion on the front pages with politicians being interviewed. This might be too much that we see the president using this kind of language and insulting African Americans and Jews and cursing. And that is actually the first time you say, well, Republicans break in the spring of 1974. But now, because of this kind of flow of what's in his mind communication, it's impossible to even reach that shock level, let alone that other presidents will follow. It's a dramatic contrast to 1974. Now you don't need them deleted, and you have lots of them, and it doesn't really seem to hit the public psyche.
Would it be fair to say Trump is our most transparent president ever?
At some level. At some level that is true. It's true.
But then a part of that is that technology has changed.
Yeah.
Twitter was not as big when Obama was around.
Right.
He would not have used his personal account or the White House account for quite the same things. But a part of this is the evolution of the presidency. I don't necessarily think that the next president certainly will feel will utilize a direct access to the public, but I don't necessarily think that they'll feel the need to. And in fact, the American public will probably appreciate seeing a little less engagement on that level. I think it's also significant to remember that there's something more nostalgic about each president. Even in recent memory, every time Obama, releases a list of the books he's read, we all think, oh my God, you remember when we had a president who read books?
So you mean there'll be Trump nostalgia at some point?
Yeah, a little bit, I think. Or what if we get a president who decides, that to make this show sort of Washington-esque and hold back and allow us to go on with our lives without being constantly inundated? We might miss some of that.
What percentage of the American people are currently supporting Trump? Presumably they would be nostalgic for Trump when he leaves.
I know, for sure.
Well, sort of tied to this communication style question is sort of this leadership trait, I guess you could call it, of like bullying. It's kind of a word we hear a lot. So I'd be curious how you all sort of think about, whether it's through Twitter or not, some of those tactics that Trump uses, and what to you feels familiar or new when you think about someone like Lyndon Johnson, or, you had mentioned even Andrew Johnson going out and, using very vitriolic language about political opponents. So is there something really different here fundamentally, or we sort of see this?
Have we ever had a president who's been there's just such hubris. I think there's usually some insecurity about the institution. There's some protectiveness of it, and you don't see it. There's so much recklessness going on, and I think that's sort of there. It's the way he ran his businesses, and we've just never seen that before.
I mean, the most iconic image of Lyndon Johnson is the treatment, which is where he was about 6'3", 240 pounds, and he would literally hover over members of Congress or cabinet officials and stand in their space, and famously wouldn't walk away until they agreed to give him what he wanted. And you can look up. There's a famous one with Richard Russell, and he did this. If you listen to the phone conversations, he could really berate people, bully them. I mean, he was a bully, and he could berate them until they would do what he wanted, or he would berate them when they didn't do what he wanted. And there's a lot of mythology about it, but he certainly was not kind. You know, he would. Joe Califano is one of his domestic advisors, tells the story in his memoirs that they were going to, and several members actually say this. He would take him into the pool, and he would get naked, the president, and he'd jump in the pool, and he said, "Come on, we're going to skinny dip and talk about our strategy." And they'd have to go, and he could stand in the pool, and a lot of them were smaller, and they'd have to like wade, and it was a humiliating experience. And there's lots of stories like this. Once he called Califano, and Califano's secretary said he's in the bathroom, so he can't come right now. And so Johnson said, "I want a phone in his bathroom so I can reach him whenever, the hell I want to reach him." But he didn't do it, interestingly, in public. His speeches are very contained, Lyndon Johnson. He didn't lash out in the media that much. There's a couple occasions. But part of what Trump does that is certainly different than LBJ, and I assume maybe not Andrew Johnson, but Andrew Johnson didn't have this kind of platform, is really lash out against specific individuals who are often his opponents in demeaning, berating ways. And the difference isn't was one a bully or not. It's what do you do on the public stage as president? What is your approach to leadership that way? And that's what we're seeing, that it's hard to replicate that.
Any thoughts about Johnson comparisons or?
Earlier Johnson
Yes.
won?
Andrew Johnson.
I think that Andrew Johnson was just losing it, actually, by the end of his term. Seriously, I do. I think he was so distraught. He was so out of his depth, and he had this uncontrolled rage. And in a way, he gets an asterisk of you can't compare to that circumstance and that person. I think Johnson, too, Lyndon's bullying was much more strategic. It was much more a part of his essential. Do you think that's a fair contrast?
Yeah.
So maybe just one last thing, and then we'll kind of just open it up to whatever questions all of you have. But Julian, you wrote this great book called Fault Lines, and I thought it would be helpful and interesting to have you just talk a little bit about, sort of the thesis of it, which is that a lot of what we're seeing today was sort of born out of 1974, our Watergate experience. To what extent is the sort of reality we're living right now kind of the fallout of 3-4 decades ago?
Yeah, I mean, the book I wrote it with Kevin Cruz, and the heart of the book is that these divisions have been building for many decades, and President Trump is often exploiting them. He's diving into them in ways that we haven't seen before. But he's operating on a foundation that it's the creation of post-1960s American politics. Not just that the nation's divided. That's a complicated story. But a lot of our institutions do work to foster these kinds of political divisions. So we write in this book a lot about how the media changed from the network era to this cable, internet, Wild West era. We talk about how the political parties changed into institutions that really have, especially the Republican Party, entrenched a partisan approach to governance in a systematic way that involves money, involves media operations, involves the actual composition of the parties. And that's what we're trying to argue. And it is Trump is the culmination rather than the cause of the divisions. The pessimistic part of that story is, even if you have variations on him or a tamer president to follow, it's not going to go away. We wrote the book before Trump was president, before it was on the radar that he was going to be president. We were really thinking about the Obama years and what you were seeing in Washington with the Tea Party and how Fox Media was working then. So we didn't predict President Trump, but it certainly followed the logic. And that's how history works. It's easy to tell political history often through presidents. It's very satisfying. It's simple. It's 4 year, 8 years. They're out. One person. But really, we were interested in the context of how this came about and how it's working. And I think that's really important to remember as we debate what comes next.
Could I ask Julian a question?
Yeah.
So I know historians aren't known for giving prescriptions.
Yes.
But do you have any thoughts about how this pattern might get reversed? Or
How it can get reversed.
Yeah.
I think, for me, two things can happen. One is a really dramatic election outcome, either this time or even in a few years, that shakes the Republican Party. In a very partisan moment, the only thing that's going to change the way a party operates is big loss to the party. That's the logic of partisanship. And so if you had a recreation of the 1964 election, meaning a landslide defeat, a humiliation for the party, that could have an effect of causing Republicans, not because of niceness, not because of, that was not a good thing to do, but because it's not a winning strategy. All these predictions about demography in the Republican Party don't play. That could change it. And the second path is a 1970s style moment or a progressive era moment when reform becomes an actual issue, where people, which they rarely are interested in how do our institutions work. And we had a lot of changes in the 70s in presidential campaign finance, in sunshine laws. A lot of our politics is more open now. Didn't turn out to be better, but it is different. There's a lot less secrecy. Ethics rules changed. We need something like that to deal with redistricting, to deal with campaign finance. We need a moment of institutional introspection if it's actually going to change. Those are the two paths I see to something big happening. Otherwise, I think we're in this period for a while to come.
Thanks.
Great. Well, actually, maybe one last thing, just to go back to something that you said at the very beginning, Alexis, about how knowing about the intense partisanship of the beginning of the country lends a certain comfort as you look out today. Maybe before we turn it over to questions, if each of you wants to just say, to what extent your study of the presidency has made you feel sort of more scared about today's moment or sort of more comforted. I feel like it's a question I get having done the presidential podcast that I struggle to answer sometimes, but.
Such a hard question. I think on my worst days, I tend to think I've spent so much time observing and studying how this country came together, and I'm living through its downfall to a certain extent. A lot of the concerns that the founders had about corruption and decay, that seems to be happening. On my best days, I think about something I think I already said tonight, which was that, a lot of these guys were businessmen. They were unlikely revolutionaries. They were reluctant. It took them decades to take action. And so I do believe that, I believe in Americans in America, and that, we can rally when necessary and even be interested in, civil service reform. It's happened. So I don't know. I think there is the idea of renewal, and that's me on a positive day. That's me on a good day.
I'm very worried about where we are, but the kinds of questions I get about my historical area of focus, people say, well, is it as bad as the Civil War? And I say, well, we haven't killed 750,000 people yet. And, people in Congress were armed. One person I wrote a biography of was from South Carolina, senator, and he said anyone who doesn't have two knives or a gun has two knives and a gun. It's just everybody who is bringing weapons into Congress. You know the story of how that unfolded, and we haven't gotten to that yet. So that can give me some basis for hope.
I see. I have two positions too. So one is I've seen presidents just can make immense mistakes. So it doesn't make me feel better. We have gotten into wars because of dumb things that presidents have done. We have had social passions inflamed because of the strategies that presidents were willing to take or issues they were willing to not address. I don't believe crises inevitably will be resolved. I think the political system can easily gridlock, and presidents can be stubborn people who don't do the right thing. So there's part of my study of presidents of Washington that say, well, we might not be in a civil war yet, but A, we were in a civil war once. So let's remember that. And B, we've just had a lot of other terribly consequential, poor decisions by leaders. The good part is, I keep talking about this 60s book, but when Johnson's presidency started, the mood about Washington was actually very glum. Not just because of Kennedy's assassination, but there was a sense in 63 and 64 Washington was totally broken. And if you read a lot of the newspapers and op-eds and books that were popular, it's all about the dysfunction of Congress and how the conservative Southerners and Republicans from the Midwest wouldn't do anything. They weren't going to address civil rights ever. They weren't going to deal with health care for the elderly. And the story of the Great Society is remarkable because citizen pressure through the civil rights movement, through union activists, it changes for a few years, just for a few years, but it changes the conventional wisdom. It changes what the reality was in Washington in pretty profound ways. And it turns someone as powerful as Lyndon Johnson to the side of this civil rights question. So I always remember that. I always remember that switch that takes place because of grassroots pressure. And I remember that can happen again. And I don't forget that. And I think that's a possibility today as well, whether it's through elections or whether it's through activism.
Better angels of our nature.
Yeah.
Right?
All right, do we have some questions from the audience? I see one here.
I'm terrified, well, a lot of things, but particularly that 30-40% of the country thinks that this behavior is okay. But you just mentioned that maybe 30% thought that slavery was okay 100 years ago or more. Should I be as terrified as I am, or is that is it not as bad as it was, in 1850 or 60?
How do I make that comparison? I guess what I want to say to you is we desperately need civic education in this country. And whether we think we're better or worse than a country in which a substantial portion of the nation was committed to the preservation of slavery, that was pretty awful. I think we're probably in a better place now than that. But we need to be in a far better place than the one we find ourselves. And for me, that means explaining and understanding what constitutional limits are and what leadership is and some of the terrible mistakes that presidents have made so people can try to choose presidents who aren't likely to make those mistakes again. So having spent my whole life as an educator or in school, one or the other, it may seem obvious that I would say we need education, but I think we desperately do it from kindergarten on about what this nation is and must be.
Oh, sure. That's actually similar to what I wanted to ask about is on the flip side, we've talked a lot about communication from the presidential side, but there's also knowledge among voters. And is there precedence when we now have access to more information than our forebears would ever thought possible? Where does precedent change, or how did information flow? And I think there's a big question around the Electoral College and can we trust the popular vote? These are kind of questions that technology changes and the information that we have as voters change, and interest in people learning more about this changes. So any, comments from sort of knowledge of the populace over time would be really appreciated.
Well, the possibilities with information are really remarkable today. You can find out who's giving money to who. You can find out what the different in congressional races or state races, where competitive districts are. You can get a lot of information through citizen groups that use FOIA requests to find out pretty quickly what's happening and get documentation. There's lots of news. Not all of it's good, meaning the quality, but there is a lot of commentary. There's a lot of sources to keep track if you're interested in politics. The bad part is kind of, what do we make of all this? It's an overload. It's segmented, meaning it's kind of designed for people who want it rather than a commons for a broad part of the population to get their initial set of facts. And it's absolutely filled with disinformation and falsehood because there's so much and it's so open-ended. But I think that's where intermediary institutions work. People often ask me how I think of my life as a professor and my life doing TV and radio and all that. And I often say the more I've done this, the more I appreciate my role at the university, meaning not that they're disconnected, that I actually think institutions from public schools at a lower level to colleges, one of the things they have to help people do in terms of civic information is how to use this information world that we have, how to distinguish what's good and bad, how to find out how are you going to make sense of this as a citizen so that it's something that's productive. And universities are only one part of this. But I think there needs to be people and institutions that do that for younger generations. Otherwise, we have these riches of information that will be unused, and they will be hard to recognize the good versus the bad. So I think you're kind of tapping into something really important right now. We've lost, decades ago, there were just more filters and it was more centralized. So in the 50s and 60s, you had 3 TV networks, you had a handful of city papers that were really dominant. And now there's just so much that good also comes with this challenge.
Thanks. Oh, sure. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on Andrew Jackson presidency within this context. Thanks.
No one wants to take Jackson.
Well, I guess, I mean, I don't want to deal, Andrew Jackson's always the model other than Richard Nixon that Trump is kind of compared to. It's interesting in itself. No one compares him to George Washington or Lincoln as far as I can tell. But this kind of, populism's a tough word, and I think it's not always clear what people mean. But this uglier, more reactionary use of an appeal to the masses and to people who are not the elites in an effort to divide, to polarize, to attack, there is some similarity there. It's such a different period. I hate to make that comparison. But I think that is a little bit of a tradition that he has inherited.
And would you say Jackson would fit within the bully category a bit?
Yeah. I mean, no, he's a good example.
Andrew Jackson was he was young, but he was an elected official when Washington left office, and he was the one guy who didn't stand up to say goodbye. He didn't show his respect in that way. And so I think he is this, singular figure. But I keep thinking with all these questions and what we've been talking about tonight, that we come back to education, we come back to civic education. We have to work on not only teaching kids from just the youngest age to be involved in history, in our living history and in the presidency, but also to hold parties accountable. A huge part of this president, his problem, it's the party. Yeah. And also as historians, we have to work on, how we talk about the presidency. Mm-hmm. And I'm not addressing anyone on this stage because this is not a problem of these historians. And Julian and I are talking about this on Tuesday in New York, that we need to think about these men as they've been and think about the role more expansively, women, people of color, And we need to be a little less reverent, and it's not about who you want to have a beer with or who you want as your role model. These people are historically significant and have real effects on our lives and the lives of our children and generations to come. And that's how we should think about it, not about, these cult of personalities. Andrew Jackson is, known as this aggressive sort of, people almost talk about him in this like fun way, and that's sort of disturbing. We don't really get a lot from there. And so I think we need to just sort of generally do an overhaul. And it's not that, that historians don't want this, that they're not engaging with the public. That's not what's going on. There is just this sort of like overhaul that needs to happen let's start in kindergarten. Let's start as early as we can.
Just to something that struck me when you were talking about civic education, and Julian, I'm betting you would know these numbers far better than I, but what about voter turnout in our country and the history of voter turnout over time and all the people who aren't voting at all? And maybe they're overwhelmed with information and they need to be more critical about using it, but if they don't go and vote afterwards, we are in a terrible place. And it's gone way down, right?
It's gone way down. 19th to 20th century remains under 50%. Congressional elections even much worse. And not only that, I mean, now we actually have efforts to restrict the vote, which is the ultimate bad decision. In a moment, you want more engagement, but it's a long-term problem that has not been reversed, and might get worse, not only because people are turned off, but because people literally can't come to the voting booth. I'd say ask more questions.
I think there's a question up here in the front too.
I actually was hoping that you could talk more about what Ms. Coe was saying about the cult of personality, because this is the first presidency that I've been an adult for, and it feels abnormal, but I'm not sure.
You mean among his supporters? Yeah, it's part cult of personality. It's part Fox News, and I don't mean that just to slam Fox News, but it's not as if he just magically has this hold on people. There's something to it, but I think there's an infrastructure behind it, which is important to remember. So he does have a communications apparatus that many presidents would have envied in previous years, because it's very systematic, it's disciplined, it keeps sending out the same heroic message about the president and creating a narrative, if you watch it, about his opponents. It's like a wrestling show constantly, seriously, in terms of who the new villain was at the moment. And so it's not simply a cult of personality. That's where that institutional part of this comes in. Also, the power of the party apparatus in the GOP is pretty astounding. To maintain discipline, to get out messaging, the social media skills of the Republican Party right now far outweigh where the Democrats are, and that all benefits President Trump in keeping his strength. And so the cult of personality is important, but I don't think it just happens automatically. I don't think it's because he's so charismatic that he wins everyone over. I think these other things are at work which help to, he feeds into that. And that's really, really important as well. But he is, the other part, he's a TV person. And so he kind of came of age, whether as a business person in New York, everyone from the 80s will remember, to The Apprentice, and he understood how to sell a character. And so within this apparatus, I think he uses some of those skills to win people over.
Okay, now it's finally my turn. All right, first and foremost, I want to say thanks to all of you for being here. I wish there were more people in the audience to listen in, especially at this time in history. And I agree with everything that you all are saying, especially where Alexis, you talk about, incorporating. I think we should incorporate technology, and especially in social media, into civic education, as we all look back at what happened in the 2016 election. And I feel like we are in a civil war, because even though, like you said, we didn't kill 750,000 people have not been killed, but more than 750,000 people's views have been altered by disinformation. So to me, sites like Facebook and Twitter, that's just as deadly as any bomb or grenade that that can be used against an enemy. And that's also the new bully pulpit, the way I see it. Trump is definitely using Twitter as his bully pulpit, even if he's not on television, making fun of an XYZ or whatever. I have several questions for you, but I'll go one by one. The first question I want to ask all of you is, do you guys think grounds for impeachment will change as a result of all this evidence that's come out, about Trump? And, he was still acquitted. I mean, we know he was acquitted because the Senate didn't want any witnesses to speak out. But do you think anyone else that might be charged with impeachment is going to have it easier or just as easy as Trump did?
You want me to do it? I mean, I don't know if they'll have it as easy. I think two things happen with impeachment that are important. Precedent was set. I do think the story that came out, not certainly in terms of manipulating foreign policy for his electoral purposes, targeting a specific citizen, asking a foreign government to interfere, as well as many other things he's done along the way, that's a precedent that is now not necessarily acceptable, but doable. And I think other presidents will pay attention. And he himself has precedents that came before him, which also suggested that you can get away with things. Iran-Contra is a great story if you really want to look into how far an administration could go. So I do think a precedent was just set, and I think it will be a set of arguments if a future president does something like this to say, well, it wasn't impeachable then, so maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we shouldn't upset the nation. But for me, what he certainly is aware of, and everyone should be aware of, this was a decision by Senate Republicans. It was a conscious decision to live with this and to accept it and to say, in pursuit of our partisan interest, we're going to let this go. That was very clear from the start. And so I think another president will remember that lesson, that ultimately, if you are protected by your party, if the party has enough control in the upper chamber or lower chamber, that is sufficient to insulate you, even if you go pretty far. He will forever be an example of a president who goes as far as you can in many areas. We have lots to go, so don't even kind of think the story's over. But the lesson is just what a disciplined party on Capitol Hill can do for you. And I think other presidents will remember that.
Hi, I had a question about presidential campaigns. This cycle and the previous cycle seemed to be incredibly characterized by these outrageous campaign promises, and I was wondering if that was normal or if this is like a new phenomena.
Campaigning wasn't even a thing.
Right, you don't even have
I mean, the first campaign was a giant red ball going through town with slogans on it. I don't know. And I also, just to go back to the last question, impeachment, we know these things. We know that what this has shown, what presidents can at least we think get away with, but we don't quite know how people will talk about this later, because we know that part, right? But there is some optimism to be found. Who will suffer the consequences soon in elections? Will the Democrats, will people think that this was the right move? This was the right time? Was it the wrong time? It depends who win. Will the Republicans, be rewarded for this? Will they maintain power? So we don't quite know yet. And then campaigning, I'm going to hand off because that's like 100 years in the future.
I think an important fact that you raised, and many may not know this, is that it was not seen as seemly to campaign for well into the modern era. But when we get to the modern era, there are plenty of people who've made pretty extravagant promises.
I mean, campaigns are filled with wildly ambitious ideas that have no chance of passing. They are filled of contradictions. FDR ran by promising to balance the budget and promote new programs. LBJ's campaigning in '64 for a domestic agenda that still seemed pretty impossible was starry-eyed in many ways. And even a lot of what Reagan ran in 1980, a pretty bold conservative agenda, it wasn't really going to work. Democrats had control of Congress, certainly the House of Representatives. So campaigns are not really governing documents. I mean, that's how I see it. And any historians who studied campaigns know there's lots of things that are not clear how it's going to happen, but they are inspiration. I mean, they serve to be inspirational. They're meant to be a candidate showing I can think about things you don't see yet, or I'm going to push for things that go beyond our limits and our comfort zones. They're philosophical. Even something like the wall is philosophical. They are meant to make a statement about politics, not necessarily lay out a roadmap to policy. And sometimes they're the opening argument of a debate. And we forget this, that often shrewd presidential candidates say something big knowing they're going to have to compromise as they push for this. But you start big, you don't start at the end already. And so I think campaigns serve like all these purposes, but this isn't the first time for sure that you've had campaigns with big ideas being floated around.
Just to piggyback on that question a little bit, without obviously saying anything about who you would support for president, how knowing that a lot of what's said on the campaign trail, doesn't end up really mattering in the White House, and knowing what you know of presidential history, how do you even think about who a good president would be, who you should vote for? Like, what are the qualities that you're looking for? What are the questions that you ask yourself?
A sense of service would be nice. I would like to return to that. Not necessarily experience in government, but just some display. Someone who cares about the country. I think that would be really nice.
I would agree, and I think I would add to that someone who wants to understand problems as she or he has to address them, and that means turning to expertise in the government, turning to others who have experience in areas of foreign policy or domestic policy that can inform the decisions that the person has to make, and who is good at mobilizing that kind of information, and who has the judgment to not just take it wholesale, but to discern how to listen to it and how to use it.
Yes, I think campaigns matter, by the way. They don't not matter, and they're setting the stage for the governing part. I just don't think it means like, I'm promising this is exactly what's going to happen, and we don't have to think of it that way. But in terms of presidents, I guess I would just say someone who is committed or interested in governance. It seems kind of simple, but who understands that this is a role of political leadership, which includes problem solving and includes trying to find solutions to real problems, but is actually as interested in governance as they are in partisan power, in their own power, which is always part of the presidential mix. But what we're missing is this governance commitment. That's part of the job. It's like a big part of it. And I'd love to have a leader who thinks about that and thinks about, I have a responsibility here that goes beyond, my own time in this office. Imagine a president who sat down in the Oval Office and she or he felt that. Even if they were crass and even if they were ambitious, they also knew this was a special job. And I'd love to see someone who has that kind of a set of qualities and values be in the Oval Office.
I think listening, intellectual curiosity, and also every president is ambitious. That's not a bad thing, but ambition outside of oneself and one's party for the country. So I guess that's tied into service and and they don't even have to know about history. Really, my bar is so low there. We don't need nostalgia. I think Trump is maybe the only president who hasn't constantly mentioned the Delaware crossing, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine with me.
Integrity, I want to add.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So maybe as a follow-up to Lillian's question, I'd like to get your opinion on how do we maybe get there with some potential changes of things like campaign finance reform or term limits or ranked choice voting. What tools like that help to deliver this kind of improvement?
You must think about this.
I think about it a lot. I mean,
He's just
I'm
not
not a
the
term
spotlight.
limit person. I don't think we need less expertise or less experience in Washington. I think that goes the totally wrong direction. There's certain specific reforms I think would be important. I am someone who thinks it's not the whole problem, but certainly redistricting reform can help. And bipartisan, nonpartisan commissions in states to set up districts that are more equitable can have an effect. Had an effect when the court did the one man, one vote rulings in 62 and 64. And because of computer technology, we have taken a million steps backwards. And I think it's time for that reform. That would help in the House in terms of what are the incentives or disincentives members have to reach any kind of deals, compromise, or get beyond their party. I think electoral college reform, it's the one I usually say it's never going to happen. Probably won't. But, this movement that's taking place in certain states, primarily blue states, to commit the vote to whoever wins the popular vote, that would be a good thing. We're now in an era of disconnect between popular votes and electoral college votes, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And then campaign finance reform would be important as well. I think it's hard to imagine containing large contributions anymore, but a lot of states and localities are putting forth some pretty good reforms on encouraging small donations. And we see some progress in the presidential elections on that front. Sanders, if you look at the map in terms of small dollar amounts, it's pretty astounding, whatever you think of him. The ability to raise mass amounts of money that's from small quantities, that's a good thing. President Trump did that to a certain extent as well. And so there seems to be space in our political system for moving away from soft money, bundled donations as the only method. And again, there are some places that are actually encouraging it through tax incentives and everything. That would be a good thing. And finally, look, I don't know if it will happen. There was the Senate just passed war power kind of vote that it's probably going to be toothless. But if ever people are thinking about presidential power and congressional legislation to restrain it, this is the moment. And I think it would be good to see some guidelines passed by Congress that have bite in terms of what a president can't do in terms of manipulating foreign policy.
Restoration of voter rights to people who have been
Yeah, for
incarcerated.
sure.
That's really exciting in Florida and promising.
Although I got stalled.
I know, promising.
Yeah, there's no excuse for the voting restrictions. There is zero excuse. And every Republican should be as mad as a Democrat, but it is a partisan issue. And that's a reform to undermine something that's been going on in Georgia, in Florida, in North Carolina. The number of states with these restrictions is hard to fathom. And there's a specific origins. I mean, this has been attempted since the 80s. It accelerated in the early 2010s. But it was the Shelby decision that overturned the Voting Rights Act that opened the floodgates in 2014. Congress should pass legislation to restore the VRA. That should not be a partisan issue, and there's no need to kind of work against increasing the vote.
You said it's been a movement since the 80s. I would say the 1880s and 1890s when you think about those southern
That's
states
true.
and
That's true.
disfranchisement. It's
That's
a
true.
it's a pattern.
I think, Alex, there's one more question back there.
So, Julian, I've been trying to work through the idea of talking about the strong parties and the GOP kind of consolidating behind Trump, because I'm wondering how much of it is that is the party being strong, or that's Trump able to kind of cannibalize the party and his own vision. I guess I'm I just wrapped up listening to the 538 Primaries Project that kind of worked through the modern history of the primary system, talking about how we had this era of strong parties in the 80s, 90s, but now we're really like identity and personality dominated now. And now we have, in the Democratic primary, the leading candidate doesn't identify as a Democrat. So how much is it we do have strong parties, and how much of it is that we have strong personalities that parties are kind of consolidating behind?
He didn't cannibalize the party. The party is changing for several decades. A lot of the key issues he supports have been developing strong support within the GOP for a while now, such as kind of immigration restriction. The intense focus on partisanship as the number one principle in making decisions is something we've seen with the GOP since the Gingrich era. You saw it with the Tea Party and raising the debt ceiling, where that literally could be held hostage and threaten to send the country into default in demanding a certain number from the president. We've seen these things again and again. Even this alliance between the conservative media and the Republican Party, this has been going on for a while. The man just honored, Rush, he had been coordinating with Republicans since the late 80s and early 90s. And so all of these things are not Trump cannibalizing the Republican Party. What the Republican Party is doing is saying we're fine with President Trump and everything he does if we see this as beneficial to our power. What you have is a Republican Party with a narrowing of its electoral base. That is true. It's smaller. The Democrats potentially could have a much broader base. So then you use every institutional mechanism to protect yourself. And you don't give in even an inch, even if a president is doing all sorts of wild-eyed things. And so I don't think, I think I see it that way. That's much more how I see the story. And Trump is just a president. He's so comfortable with he's comfortable with the worst parts of our politics. He doesn't care. I do think that. And part of it is he's not committed to governance. He has little sense of history. He's power thirsty, whatever you want to say. But he exploits things that are there, including his own party. That's what he's doing. He exploits the way our media works. He exploits the way the Republican Party and its partisanship works. But he's not kind of the cause and cannibalizing them. That's a mythological or nostalgic look of where the Republican Party has been in the past few decades.
All right, I think, where's Alex? Are we done, or do we have, okay, we're done, he's saying. Thank you so much, Julian, Drew, Alexis. I really appreciate you being here and all of you being here. I know Alexis has books out at the front, which I imagine you'll be signing for anyone. But, maybe a few of us will stick around if anyone has lingering questions, wants to chat out there for a minute. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.